It's a pleasure to be joined by two of the biggest researchers in the baseball space, critically acclaimed authors and SABR board members, Dan Levitt and Mark Armour. Dan, Mark, thanks for joining our show.
Appreciate being on. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yeah, and today we just wanted to kind of base our conversation around their new book, Intentional Balk, which highlights the baseball's thin line between innovation and cheating and what qualifies as each. And it's clear reading the book that baseball and cheating, they've got a long history together. Dan, Mark, where do you guys want to start it off?
Well, I'll take just part of the history side of this because, baseball first became sort of popular, if you will, back in the 1850s in and around New York City in particular. And as soon as you had these club teams playing each other competitively, teams started cheating. I mean, they were getting ringers from other teams. You had players jumping. If a team had a big match, player would jump from one team to another. The game was supposed to be an amateur, but shortly thereafter, you had teams paying players, right? So by 1860, you had teams paying players under the table. So this goes back to the very beginning. One other early example is at the time you had to pitch underhand, and depending on exactly which rules you were playing with, you had to keep a straight arm. And later it was raised so your arm couldn't go above your waist. Well, by the time you had that rule, you had players hiking up their pants extra high to make their waist look like it was higher up and you could get a spot. So whether it was teams or players, these were competitive people in very competitive matches, and they were doing anything they could to get an advantage.
Yeah, I think an important distinction too is the fact that for most players in baseball history, this is like their livelihood. This is their job, what they're making money off of. And as competitive players who are not only competing, for their own personal legacy, but also for money to put food on the table, you're going to have to try and find some advantage. Mark, do you have any examples from history of competitive people just trying to find an advantage, put themselves ahead in this game that we love?
Sure. I mean, the one thing I always tell people who I think are naturally skeptical about the idea that everybody cheats, and we don't actually believe that everybody cheats, but if you have a team of two teams of people, chances are there's somebody on there that's trying to think of a way to sneak around. I always think of it like this: like if you ever played, pick up basketball or soccer at the playground or something, there's always like that one guy, right, that is like trying harder than everybody else. And we use the word competitive. We've always used the word competitive to describe these people, but there's a limit to how competitive you want people to be that you're playing with, right? It's like that one guy that throws the elbow a little too hard and whatnot and tries to get away with it. And certainly when you're playing the game without referees or without umpires, there are always going to be people that are stepping on the line and not admitting it, fouling you, not admitting it, claiming that a goal went over the line when it really didn't. That's kind of always happened. And then once you have umpires or refs, then essentially the game becomes, how can I fool this guy or this woman to not call what is obvious to me to be the case? Trapping the ball in the outfield is an example, missing a base accidentally. But by the 1890s or so, there were teams that were not missing bases accidentally. They were missing bases on purpose because there was only one umpire. In the 1890s, and it wasn't until the teens they got two umpires, and then gradually they added an umpire every few years. It wasn't until the 1950s that we had four umpires, and we added those umpires in part because the game is complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on, but in part because everybody's trying to cheat. They're trying to do things behind the umpire's back, and the guy can't watch everything. So I just ask readers or people that are interested in the subject to just realize that these are, as you said earlier, professionals, and the most competitive people you've ever played with. There's 25 of them on the Seattle Mariners or the Chicago Cubs, and they are not dishonest people, any more dishonest than your friends and family are. But they're hyper competitive, and their livelihood depends on this. Maybe their careers, maybe this isn't true for Mike Trout, but for most people playing, getting this hit here or stealing this base there could make the difference between whether they have a baseball career. So there's going to be cheating.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, the umpires being involved in it. And it kind of brings the question is, if a guy's just trying to fool the umpire and he gets away with it, do we consider that cheating? And kind of just in general, where's the line between cheating and then just smart, innovative baseball where you're just trying to gain that advantage versus when is it too far and considered cheating in cases?
Well, I would say, just to finish up what I was talking about before, what we decided at the start was that we would define cheating as needing two things to be happening. One is that you are breaking a known rule, and two, that you did so in order to gain an advantage for yourself or your team. So I would argue that most of these things that we're talking about are cheating. Now, the second question is, and this is just maybe it's a matter of semantics, but I think we consider all of this stuff cheating. But then the second question is, some cheating is okay. Some cheating is, everybody agrees that this is maybe cheating by our definition, that, and again, we made up the definition, but it's kind of okay to do because the players and the umpires and everybody else involved has sort of agreed that this is competitiveness. But the line, the tricky thing, the thing that causes baseball trouble is when it gets to the point where there isn't agreement on this issue. Like, sign stealing was okay until people decided that, well, maybe it wasn't okay. And then you ended up essentially having what turned out to be sort of a crisis within baseball world because they hadn't come up with a rule or enforced it.
Yeah, I think that enforce it part is kind of what it comes down to a lot of the time. And think of another recent cheating scandal with the sticky stuff kind of that sparked a little bit last year, the last couple of years, because everyone knew it was happening. Everyone knew pitchers were using a little bit of something. And then the MLB decided to actually enforce the rule that they've had for so long. And now, I mean, you look at baseball fans and they get on pitchers who, if they look at the baseball savant numbers and see the spin rates up, they're like, oh, this person's using sticky stuff. And baseball fans are now actually getting upset about it. Whereas you look a couple of years in the past, everyone knew it was happening. Everyone was okay with it. So is it fair to say that it often comes down to who is enforcing it and whether it's actually being enforced?
Yeah, I mean, we actually sort of look at four different categories of this kind of thing. As one of the things as historians, we're trying to sort of systematize and put some context around what's going on here. And so I think there's sort of three things that we have found where you have this sort of controversy or chaos. The first is where there's no formal rule, but everybody believes it's cheating. All right. And an example of that would be sign stealing, particularly in the 20th century with binoculars, where there was all sorts of controversies around people using binoculars to steal signs, but there was actually no rule. There was no rule that said you couldn't have something, something artificial or in the outfield and try and steal signs. And yet everybody kept it secret. And when it was exposed, people tried to deny it. So clearly that was an issue. And it kind of led to where we ended up with the Astros eventually. Another one is where there's a rule against it. People are generally ambivalent. So I'm going to use your example of the sticky stuff or anything, substances on the ball. And here you had, for example, everybody was talking about, pitchers cheating, but between Nelson Potter in 1944 and Gaylord Perry in 1982, nobody was actually suspended or for having, illegal stuff on the ball, even though there was all kinds of conversations around it. So, and another would be where you have a rule and everybody agrees it's bad, but you can't enforce it or you can't detect it. Maybe steroids during the 90s are an example of that, where I think, everybody felt like this is wrong. Nobody was admitting it, but yet there was no way to enforce it. You couldn't test, so you didn't know who was doing it, and there weren't penalties against it anyway. So, when you have any of those three situations, you're just going to end up with sort of a problem at the end. And it's only when baseball finally sort of decides, okay, we got to do something about this and put in a rule, that it settles itself out in some sort of rational way. And in fairness to baseball, you can't predict everything that's going to happen. Part of you has to be reactive as people come up with new stuff. Sometimes baseball's pretty quick in getting on top of it, and sometimes, they're a little bit more clumsy about it, and it's a little bit more awkward.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that. I mean, people, steroids was such a big deal in the 90s. People talked about it certainly into the 2000s until we finally had testing. But I think one of the challenges there was that everyone really, I shouldn't say everyone, but I think generally a lot of people liked the game then. They really liked what was happening. And I think that there was a little bit, the fan backlash was kind of a little bit behind maybe then, because everybody was like, are you sure this is, well, I shouldn't say, I don't think the conversation was that open, but I think that there was just less pressure on baseball to do anything, even though I think that even Commissioner Seelig, I think, got to the point where it was maybe a little bit embarrassing for him. But I think that the sticky stuff was different because I think people don't like the game now as much. There's a lot of commentary around the fact that the pitchers have these incredible advantages, and you're watching these videos on Twitter that it just seems like the pitches are unhittable. It's like a video game or like a wiffle ball. And I think that if you watch these pitches and you see these spin rates and you see some people throwing 102 mile an hour two-seamers, then I think it's easy to look at the fact that they're cheating and sort of say like, well, this needs to be stopped because it's resulting in a game that we don't really like as much. And I think most baseball fans, I think if you polled them, would say that there's too many strikeouts. So I think that people are hoping that if we can cut the spin rates down, we'll have fewer strikeouts and maybe the game will get a little bit better. So I think that there is always going to be the sort of the marketing aspect of what's the game we want, and is the cheating that's currently going on hurting this? And I think that that's what's happening now.
Definitely. And the way it affects the game, and then also the way baseball responds to it is, I think it's very, very important to kind of preventing future offenses in the future. And I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the sign stealing scandal. Feels like maybe if there was a stronger punishment enforced onto, say, the Astros, for example, or the teams that were stealing signs, maybe it wasn't as big of a thing for baseball fans to react to. And it just kind of brings up the cost benefit analysis. Like, if they're not going to get a punishment, what's really stopping them from doing the future, other than, fans viewing them as their legacy's tarnished? But I mean, to gain that competitive advantage, where's the line between, is it worth it or not?
Well, George Bamberger, who was an old manager of the Brewers and Mets, had a great quote, and on what I would call the cost benefit analysis of playing professional baseball. I mean, he said, we do not play baseball. We play professional baseball. Amateurs play games. We are paid to win games. There are rules and there are consequences if you break them. If you are a pro, then you often don't decide whether to cheat based on if it's right or wrong. You base it on whether or not you can get away with it and what the penalty might be. So, the point here is obviously there's sort of a moral side to this, and then there's it's not really cheating. It's what can I get away with and what can I get caught with? And, to a certain degree that works when you're talking about umpires on the field and trapping the ball. And then there's the instant replay that you can look back and, overturn a call. But, if you're talking about a cork bat, I mean, how do you catch a cork bat? So it leads to certain things that are much, much more complicated to try and deal with if you're looking at just sort of this cost benefit analysis. And so that's part of what's going on. And just one quick aside on the sign stealing scandal, which we talk about, is that, Rob Manfred, in response to the Boston's Apple Watch scandal, where they were using the Apple Watch in the dugout to transmit signals, he came out in the middle of September in 2017 and said, with a memo to the team saying, all right, this is going to stop. Here's the penalty to the Red Sox. And if this continues, we're going to punish the manager and the GM. We're going to hold them responsible. And probably that's all he could do. He couldn't really do anything to the players at that time without some agreement through the union. And so, to me, it's sort of like, after September 15th or whatever the exact date was, 2017, at that point, he kind of laid down the line. And if you were, doing, sign stealing, using electronics signaling after that, you were going to get punished. And obviously he brought it down on the Astros. And since then, now there's been player penalties that have been worked into the collective bargaining agreement. So, I think they took a scandal and now there's penalties against it and you're unlikely to see it. And I think that's generally the way sort of life works, right? I mean, someone gets caught and there's an issue around it, what's the penalty? And then sort of the situation, an equilibrium comes where the penalty and the benefits sort of match.
I think a lot of baseball fans are maybe not completely happy with the way that Rob Manfred handled that specific decision. And I think a lot of people point to the fact that no Astros players were suspended a single game for that whole scandal that lasted, seasons in the postseason and ended up them winning a World Series. Whereas, something just recently where Pyrus Rodolfo Castro, his phone falls out of his pocket, he gets suspended and none of the Astros did. Do you think that people are now realizing that there is more of a punishment for the sign stealing scandal because of what Rob Manfred did? Or do you think that's more based on the way that the fans look at the way the Astros cheated?
I think a lot of it has to do with I think people occasionally misunderstand how much power Rob Manfred actually has. I think that he, if he could wave a wand and punish the Astros that he knew were sign stealing, perhaps he would have done that. He didn't really have any way to do that. There's no way for him. He does not have that power. There are things in the CBA now that gives him the ability to punish people for certain kinds of sign stealing, and that's true with steroids too. No commissioner had that power until the testing agreement was put in place and the players had to sign off on it. The commissioner doesn't have the ability to punish people without some agreement with the players in advance that this is going to happen. And of course, we know about, or Rob Manfred knows about, how the Astros stole signs because the players told him, right? That's the only way we know what we know about the Astros is because he gave immunity to the players and the players told presumably the truth, or at least part of the truth. So, it's kind of a catch-22. I think it's going to be harder in the future if there's a scandal like this, because of course the players are not going to tell him now. That was like his one shot to figure it out. And I think the fans, we tend to be, we tend to want more than just, I think, fairness. I think we also want to see people punished. That's just sort of the nature of human beings. It's like, no, I want this guy suspended. I want that guy suspended, as opposed to, wanting it to stop, which is another goal, I think, and I think an important goal. But I think sometimes we want blood, and we didn't get it, or we don't feel like we got it with the Astros, even though, again, they suspended the GM, who still doesn't have a job, and the manager for a year, the bench coach, Carlos Beltran. They suspended the people who presumably oversaw this, or at least allowed it to happen. And that's exactly what Manfred said he was going to do.
And
right.
Even if these guys aren't like actually suspended, they're also hurt in terms of that. We know that they did it. And now interesting to see if it'll maybe affect their Hall of Fame chances or whatever. Or it should be interesting. Like, even though they didn't get suspended on the field, they might face repercussions later. And obviously the fans view them differently. You see the way they get their receptions when they go to a visiting ballpark. So it's not just the suspensions too.
Yeah,
well, we'll find that out this fall, because Carlos Beltran is probably the best new person on the Hall of Fame ballot. One of my favorite players, certainly. I think that he'd be really a good candidate. I expect this is going to hurt him quite a bit, even though people don't talk too much about him because he retired after that. So therefore he hasn't been booed. He hasn't actually faced the boos like Altuve. Altuve is probably the best example of a potential Hall of Famer on that team. So we'll see.
Just as an aside, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about sign stealing is how well it stays secret. I mean, my kind of philosophy of conspiracies is that, there aren't a lot of them out there. I mean, I'm generally not a believer in conspiracy theories because anytime you have more than about 3 people who know a secret, generally it gets out there. And then you take something like the Astros, where you probably had, at least 20 people, maybe more, who knew what was going on between the players and some of the players engaged, and the front office folks who were, down there actually in the video replay room signaling them. And yet, it didn't, and there were like some rumors of it after the series, but the story didn't really come out until one of the players, Mike Fiers, who had since been traded, came out and talked about it. So it's just interesting how that took so long to come out, as even with so many people knowing about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I remember that all happening, and you had like YouTube channels that were digging in after the Mike Fiers comments, and they're some of the ones that really blew the scandal out of the water more than somehow the MLB did, because I'm sure the MLB wanted to keep it a little bit more under wraps as they did their investigation. We had public creators coming out and kind of blowing the scandal out and putting it out into the world. We could talk about the Astros all day because it's kind of the biggest recent scandal of cheating. Are there any more of your guys' favorite stories from the book? I don't want you to have to spoil everything in between the 2 covers, but any other stories of cheating from way back in the past or even more recently that you guys want to share?
Well, let me give you one on the drug side, which a story I didn't know, and most people I know didn't know, that the first real drug scandal in baseball came around in 1951 when Hal Newhouser was the star pitcher for the 1945 Detroit Tigers. He won the MVP that year, and the Tigers won the World Series. And it came out in 1951 that he had been taking Novocaine shots in his shoulder when that was a fairly recent drug to pitch in the World Series and at the end of the season. And there was a very wide reaction to it. I mean, some of the headlines were something like, Tigers doped their way to World Series. And other ones were more like, Newhouser took Novocaine shots. And I think that sort of led to this discussion of sort of how it's evolved both in baseball and in other sports, where you have this, and again, I'm not saying this thing in baseball led to it in all sports, but it certainly led to it in baseball, where you have this restorative concept where it's getting you back to your ability to play versus sort of enhancement of your ability. So that things like cortisone shots or Tommy John surgery or LASIK surgery that nominally, and again, I think there's a big gray area there that sort of gets you back to your normal human potential, are different than things like, steroids or other performance enhancements that sort of bring you beyond sort of what your natural human limits are. I think there's this idea that for pure sport, we're testing the, human limits against each other, and that if you can artificially enhance that, somehow that's unfair. But what was interesting is this was in 1951, and there was this big debate for a few days over, taking Novocaine shots in the shoulder. And, some people were saying this is terrible. You can't do it to horses and in horse racing. And other people were saying, this is just sort of what people need to do. And it evolved from them. But that was really the first time drugs were ever a controversial issue in baseball, and allowed the sort of the conversation to evolve from that.
I think that's evolved too. And you mentioned other sports and football. I think it's so common for there to be certain drugs that players take before the game, even at halftime, to be able to get through all 60 minutes of baseball. And that's seen as okay. Whereas, we saw Fernando Tatis just recently. Large speculation is he started using PEDs to come back from an injury, but now we all view him as a cheater. So I think that's definitely a very interesting dynamic.
And again, it's a pretty big gray area between them, but I think clearly sort of philosophically, that's generally how as a sport we view it. And I would just say one other thing, and I know Mark has a couple of great stories here. But amphetamines for almost all of baseball history were viewed as a way to get through a 162 game season. Back in the 60s and 70s, especially the 60s, it changed a little bit. Trainers would have amphetamine juice in lockers for players. And, and Reggie Jackson talked about this, that the 162 game season is really hard to get through. And, amphetamines were viewed not so much as an enhancement, but as a way to just sort of get yourself through the season. Whether or not that makes it cheating or not, I mean, clearly they were illegal and you weren't supposed to be taking them. But at least from the player standpoint, they were viewed differently.
Yeah, our book is two things. It's a history book, so we want to explain to people that all the stuff that you know and love about baseball, people trying to cheat, has been going on forever. People in sign stealing since the 19th century. People have been doctoring the balls. People have been corking bats, etc. Really, the cheating sort of starts whenever the rule comes into place, or the ability to get around the rule, gets into place. But the other thing we want people to sort of realize is that the old cheating that they think is really funny from the history books is also still going on. And this is sort of a surprise. This was a little bit of a surprise to me. Dan and I are a bit older than you. And I remember reading when I was a kid, like say back in the 70s, I'd read these stories about John McGraw in the old Orioles of the 1890s, who were pretty famous, excellent team, lots of Hall of Fame players on the team, but they were really known for being outlaws. They were cutting bases, and they were holding belt loops of guys that were running around the field, and they were hiding balls in the outfield. And it all seemed to me as a kid like a little bit like a tall tale of the Old West, that people used to behave this way before we evolved into the honest people that we are now. And so when I come across something like this happening today, it's really fun to see them, because you realize that nothing has really changed. What's really changed is we have more video cameras pointing at people now, so it's a little bit harder to get away with stuff. There was a play in 2018, and I missed this when it happened, so it was really fun to find it. Adam Frazier was the third baseman for the Mets in this game, which was in Citi Field, and they were playing against the Dodgers, and the guy in the Dodgers, who I think was Alex Verdugo, hit a pop up into the right at the edge of the stands, and Frazier went over to get it, and he reached into the crowd and came out with the ball and held it up for the umpire, and the umpire called him out, and he tossed the ball back into the stands. So it was a third out, and ran off the field. And then this was not replayable, but nonetheless, the video cameras caught it. What he actually did was he didn't catch the ball at all. The ball it sort of fell into the stands, and he picked up a different ball that was like lying on a seat. He just grabbed this other ball and held it up. And this was the ball that he got the out call of. And he said afterwards, he joked about it after the game and said, yeah, it was like a rubber ball. It was like a kid's ball that the kid brought into the game. So now this kid presumably might have had two balls, the game ball, and he or she got their ball back. So, and he laughed about it after the game. Like it wasn't like he was held up to be some big cheater, et cetera. So, if you realize that this happened, 4 years ago, suddenly the John McGraw stories don't really seem so far-fetched. I mean, of course they hid balls in the grass. Why wouldn't they? It makes perfect sense that they would do that. Absolutely. And of course they held belt loops. I mean, why wouldn't they? People would do that today if there weren't 50 cameras on them and 4 umpires watching them at all times. They can't do it. So it's really just a question of like, what can we get away with? And this was the case where he found out he could.
Yeah, and it just sort of goes back to the umpire thing. So, Todd Frazier, there wasn't really any backlash against him in the same way that people sort of look at the old Orioles as boys being boys. It's just, it's if you can get away with it, it's probably okay. Although sometimes the reaction's different, and Mark, the story better than I did with Derek Jeter.
One of the things that happens occasionally in baseball is somebody will pretend they got hit by a pitch. And this seems very innocuous, right? And a lot of the cheating that I think if people read this book, they will say, well, that doesn't seem that bad. Or God, that's horrible. I can't believe somebody did that. And I think that is not something we really necessarily try and talk anybody into. We just tell them what the rules are, right? These are the rules. The rule was broken. And most famously, Derek Jeter. I think other people have done this, but Derek Jeter is a good person to talk about because he's pretty famous and also considered, I think, by most people to be a pretty upstanding, honest person. So it's a good example for us. He was in a game a few years ago, near the end of his career, in fact, and it was against Tampa Bay, and he got a ball up, on the handle, which and he kind of, not only did he tell the umpire he got hit, he actually called the trainer out, and the trainer sprayed his hand down. He was like shaking it, and then when you see the replay, it very clearly hit the knob of the bat. It didn't hit his hand at all, and after the game, he said, the umpire tells me to go to first base. I'm going to go to first base. And Joe Madden, who was the manager of the Tampa Bay, said, he got kicked out of the game, arguing the play. But then after the game, he said, well, if it was one of my guys, I'd be cheering him on. So they all kind of know that this is how baseball is played, right? It is not the honor code that, supposedly if you did this played for the Naval Academy, supposedly you get expelled from because you not only do you have to not lie, you have to tell the truth at all times, and Jeter obviously did not. But that's how baseball is played, and it's played that way not just by the people that everybody likes to dislike, but also by people like Derek Jeter. We have stories in there from Hank Greenberg, Gil Hodges, people that are considered sort of upstanding, people that you want your kids to be like. And we have stories about them, which I think are even more fun because it's not just Jose Canseco cheating is not really breaking news, but Hank Greenberg cheating is kind of cool, I think.
I remember a play like that. I think it was either last season or 2020 in the Mets Marlins game where Brandon Nimmo, like at the end of the game, leans in his elbow to get by pitch. And I remember watching that. I didn't think it was cheating. I was like, the umpire should have realized that's what he was doing. But I mean, good for him for getting away with it. I know if the Giants did it and I was watching, I'd be happy about it. And I know if the team playing them did it, I wouldn't be happy about it. But it's kind of one of those things that's like you're breaking a rule and you're deceiving the umpire. But I personally wouldn't consider it cheating. I don't know if everyone else shares that opinion about it, but I watched that and I didn't think Brandon Nimmo's a cheater. I thought he just got away with a good play.
Yeah, there's some things that it's obviously a gray area. Like a lot of teams, like you said, Joe Madden said, well, if my guy did it, I'd be cheering him on. There's a lot of those scenarios, and like you said, trapping the ball, obviously that can't happen with replay now, but before, I mean, any teams would do that. And that just seems like competitive advantage and something that they didn't get caught with. So yeah, there's definitely like Jack said, if it happened for my team, I'd be happy about it. And if it happened against me, I'd be upset. So you're right. There's so much gray area with this as well. And it's just what can you get away with? And then what crosses the line. So it's just fascinating, all these stories to read.
I know.
One analogy we use very early in the book, just to get people, I think one of the things we want to set the scene for people is for them to know that they're like this too, that most people are like this, even though you might think you're not. Like if the speed limit on the highway is 60 miles an hour, you're going to drive over the speed limit, and you have in your head a limit that you've decided on what you actually can drive. Like maybe at 68, that's the speed you're allowed to drive. Any more than that, somebody passes you and you're in 68, you're like, I can't believe that guy's driving so fast, even though you're both cheating. And I think we naturally do this, and the society kind of works because people have kind of come up with this way of driving. And I think cops, you can't pull all the cheaters over. And the baseball has kind of found this equilibrium as well. And I think instant replay has kind of messed with this a little bit, because I think instant replay is catching things that people didn't really want to have it catch, because it's like things that people kind of want in the game, but there's no way to tell instant replay to have this nuance, right? You either it's in the rule or it's not. So
And just going back, the deception of the umpire is one area that we spend time on in the book, and it's obviously really fun to talk about. But that's a fairly narrow area, and there's all kinds of other stuff. There's the front office shenanigans around roster rules, and a lot of this stuff where you actually have to dig in and do the research to catch it, or someone actually has to do an investigation to catch it. That's where I think cheating is much more clearly where we feel differently about it, where there's no natural way to uncover it. And that's where you end up with strict penalties. One of the examples is Chris Correa, who was the scouting director for the St. Louis Cardinals, hacked into the Houston Astros database and found out all sorts of stuff. And he was eventually sentenced to 46 months in jail. That's a pretty strong deterrent. I don't think we're going to have people hacking into other teams' databases after that. And so, the harder something is to catch, generally, the more we feel like something ought to be done about it. Maybe that had something to do with the Astros and steroids, because, until testing on steroids, and how do you, there's no good way to detect the Astros until you sort of know something like that can exist, and you actually then put human monitors in these replay booths to watch what's going on.
Yeah, I think you go outside of baseball too. There was the recent with the Miami Dolphins tampering with Sean Payton and Tom Brady, and they got this huge harsh punishment that I think is going to make other teams think twice if they're going to want to do something similar. But obviously, you guys did the research. There's so many great examples throughout this book, stories that I personally have never heard, and I think tons of baseball fans around the country have never heard as well. Is there anything else that you guys want viewers to know about the book before they hopefully go out and buy a copy themselves?
The only thing I would add, and to Mark too, is that one of we talk a lot about how innovation affects cheating, and that if people come up with something new, someone will figure out a way to gain an advantage of it. This is everything from inventing the farm system by Branch Rickey, and then using it to sort of illegally corner players and keep them from being able to advance, so you keep more players in your system, to the introduction of modern prism binoculars in 1894, and by 1899 the Philadelphia Phillies are in the outfield using them to steal signs. So smart people are going to look for new ways, and as things come along, people will figure out ways to try and use them for a competitive advantage.
Yeah, like one of the big darlings of the baseball research world in 5 years ago, of course, was the Astros. Dan and I wrote about it ourselves in our previous book. There was an entire book written about the Astros, about how they were going to reinvent how baseball was run, and I think with good reason. I think that the Astros were incredibly smart about player development, about scouting, about how they evaluate players, about how they play the game itself. And all this is from really smart people that came from outside of baseball and were using new techniques that Branch Rickey would not have known to think of. And in many ways, I think there was a lot of resentment of them by a lot of the baseball people, because they were outsiders and they weren't doing it the way. And maybe this is a lesson for us, right? That it was like these people came in, they were obviously innovative, they got a lot of credit for this. And then it turns out that they were cheating. I mean, they weren't completely, it wasn't just because they were cheating. They're still a great team, right? They're one of the best organizations in baseball, and presumably they're not sign stealing anymore. But so there's a lot more to it than just cheating, but it's like they couldn't help themselves, right? And I think that's one of the lessons that Dan was just alluding to, is it's not, the people that tend to be pushing the envelope are people that are smart, not people that are just, blue collar, dumb criminals. These are smart people, and maybe they're not wrapped themselves in the baseball culture, and they don't necessarily have the same the same views about tradition as other people, but they know how to win. They know how to succeed. They're very successful people. And this happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you guys, I know how much you love baseball, and I think a lot of people might hear all these stories about baseball and think this is an anti-baseball book, but I mean, talking with you guys, it absolutely is not. I think all baseball fans would absolutely love this read. There's just some crazy stories for every generation, and thank you guys so much for joining us. It's been so fun to talk all about this with you guys.
It was great. I really appreciate getting a chance to talk to both of you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
We will be back, and you guys can find this book in our description. If you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be down in the description. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you can find it in the footnotes for the article. But Dan, Mark, thank you guys so much one last time. Make sure you go read Intentional Balk, Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovating and Cheating.